Hi, everyone, and welcome to my show called We Were Lied to About 9/11. I am your host, John Gold, and this show is part of the Soapbox People's Network. This week's show is going to focus on how governments use terrorism as a proxy. If you saw the film 9/11 Press for Truth, you will hear Paul Thompson ask the following question, quote, "The question to me is, who else was involved with Al-Qaeda? Was Al-Qaeda used as a tool just as in the 1980s the Mujahideen were basically used by the U.S. government?" End quote. I believe with regards to 9/11, this is an extremely important question that needs to be answered.
Okay, hi, this is John, and I'm here with Dr. Nafeez Ahmed. How are you doing, Nafeez?
I'm great, John. How are you?
I'm doing well. All right, I'm going to read your bio. Dr. Nafeez Ahmed is an investigative journalist, best-selling author, and international security scholar. He has contributed to two major terrorism investigations in the U.S. and U.K., the 9/11 Commission and the 7/7 Coroner's Inquest, and has advised the Royal Military Academy Sandhust, British Foreign Office, and U.S. State Department, among other government agencies. His new novel, Zero Point, predicted a U.S.-UK reinvasion of Iraq to put down an Islamist insurgency there. Nafeez is a regular contributor to The Guardian, where he writes about the geopolitics of interconnected environmental, energy, and economic crises via his Earth Insight global column. He has also written for The Independent, Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, The Scotsman, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, Quartz, Prospect, New Statesman, Le Monde, diplomatique, among many others. And I also think Raw Story was one of them at one point.
Yeah.
Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
I'm glad I remember that. All right, and I wrote a little personal bio for Nafeez. He does not know it, but Nafeez is a mentor of mine. Over the years, Nafeez has given me insights into many things that have been invaluable for my activism. He is a walking encyclopedia for many issues, and not just about terrorism and 9/11. I highly recommend watching his movie, Crisis of Civilization. In my opinion, Nafeez is brilliant in his analysis of many issues. I highly recommend reading and watching what he has to say. So, with that, how you doing, Nafeez?
I'm great. Thanks for the bio. It was very kind of you.
Oh, no problem. You deserve it. Just so everybody knows, this is actually the first time that Nafeez and I have ever spoken. We've emailed, we've corresponded, we've talked on Facebook. I was at locations that he was at, and we just never got around to talking. So this is our first time. Anyway, my first question to you is, what was the day of 9/11 like for you?
Oh, wow. I mean, that's, all I remember really is just, I think like a lot of people, just being completely and utterly shocked watching it on television. I think at the time I was living in Brighton, and we'd been living there not too long actually, about a year or so, and it just completely was it happened. It was just completely and utterly just shocking. It took me and everybody else obviously completely by surprise, and I think glued to the screens all day long. I think it was a while before I began to think a bit more critically about what actually happened on the day. But certainly it was a catalyzing event, as it was for many people, in terms of my writing and my desire to kind of get to the bottom of things. I think 9/11 was a major push in that regard. I mean, I'd been writing a lot at the time. I didn't actually have a degree at that time, but I've been writing a lot. I've been publishing on a couple of small alternative news outlets, And I remember when 9/11 happened, and I began kind of just trying to understand it, trying to deal with the kind of the backlash on Muslim communities in the UK, and kind of, as a writer at the time, I wanted to find a kind of a way of responding to that, and a way of kind of understanding and making sense of 9/11. And so that kind of led me on a path to just reading, learning, trying to understand more, and eventually I began to put together the bits and pieces that came to form my first book, The War on Freedom, which came out nearly 6 months later, actually. I think in summer of 2002. Yeah.
I don't know if that first book is actually still available to get, War on Freedom, but
I think it is.
Also, it is. I looked once, and anyway, it was hard to get. Well, Nafeez's books, incidentally, when I go into a bookstore, they're one of the books that I look to see if they have, and they rarely ever. I don't think I've ever seen one. It's one of those books that you have to go to the front desk and order. But he wrote, War on Freedom and War on Truth, and you talked about the backlash against Muslims because as a result of that day, and that's been one of the things that I've fought against for as long as I can remember. It really saddens me when someone, for instance, pushes someone who looks like a Muslim in front of a train in New York City just because they're Muslim, and it doesn't get nearly the attention that it should in this country, and it's just horrible. Muslims are our friends, no differently than Christians, Jews, and so on and so forth, but that really hits home for me, the hatred against Muslim people as a result of 9/11. What is your definition of Al-Qaeda?
My definition of Al-Qaeda, this is an interesting one. I think the basic way of understanding Al-Qaeda at the moment is that they were basically an organization of a very loosely organized network of militants that were originally recruited in the context of the Cold War. The so-called Mujahideen, recruited by the CIA and used against the Soviets. And that core kind of organizing principle, which brought these people together, and around which we saw the kind of development of the Islamist ideology that has defined Al-Qaeda's vision of the world and its ambitions for expansion, and the way that it operates tactically in the kind of terrorist attacks that it undertakes, and so on and so forth. I think that Cold War period was a very crucial period for the formation of the group. And of course, I think after that, we saw the expansion of the group due to the fact that so many different foreign fighters were recruited from many different parts of the Muslim world, hundreds of countries. And I think that is really the essence of Al-Qaeda, is that. That what we have today is the legacy of that network, where we have multiple different ethnicities, people who have basically had some kind of relationship to the network in the past, and then have gone on to be involved in new theatres of conflict, and that kind of has continued, and that the kind of efforts to basically expand and kind of grow this network have also gone on in many different ways. I think what you're getting at with that question, I would imagine, is this debate over Al-Qaeda's kind of existence in relation to different state intelligence agencies. And I think obviously that's a pretty important question. And and it's worth remembering that Robin Cook, the late foreign minister, British foreign minister, in The Guardian actually wrote a few years back, before he sadly passed away. I think this was about 1 year after 7/7, and he was talking about Al-Qaeda and the origins of Al-Qaeda. And interestingly, he pointed out that Al-Qaeda at the time, when it was first conceived, really actually referred to a database of mujahideen that was used by the CIA, which is interesting. It was the first time that anybody of that level had officially kind of referred to Al-Qaeda in that sense as relating to some kind of intelligence database of operatives. So that was an explicit indication of Al-Qaeda's function when it first came into existence as some kind of an arm of a covert arm of CIA or other intelligence agencies. And of course, what's interesting, something that I've also mentioned in the past, is that the Arabic for database is Al-Qaeda Ma'lumat. And Al-Qaeda, obviously, as is known, Al-Qaeda means the base, and Ma'lumat means data or information. So actually the kind of colloquial term for database, often used in Arabic, is simply sometimes to simply refer to it as, in short, Al-Qaeda. So that kind of explains the origin of the term. I think that kind of brings us into a whole other set of questions. But I think it's very difficult to pin down, come up with a very simplistic definition of what Al-Qaeda is today as a consequence.
In my opinion, I've said before that I think there are many definitions for what Al-Qaeda is. There's the variety that are created through FBI entrapment. There's the, quote, long-reaching tentacle myth created by the corporate media. There's the variety that are labeled Al-Qaeda that are actually insurgents against the empire. There's the variety that believe they are part of Al-Qaeda or believe in the things Osama bin Laden has said. And finally, as you were just alluding to, there's the variety that have a multitude of intelligence agency and or Pentagon connections and are used as a proxy to destabilize countries and governments. And you were talking about Robin Cook in the database. There was actually a formation, I believe in the early 90s, of what we would consider to be Al-Qaeda, and it had a list of names. It's on historycommons.org. I'd have to go look for it, but there was like a meeting of the minds, and they formed what they called Al-Qaeda. And it's unfortunate that no one else has verified Robin Cook's claims, and unfortunately he passed away, so we can't really ask him about them. Now, can you please tell us what the strategy of tension is?
Well, the strategy of tension originated as a description of covert operations that were going on in Western Europe that can be now traced back to the CIA and MI6 particularly, operating through an architecture of secret agencies, a network of secret agencies that was really to do with the NATO countries and to do with NATO military units that were linked to the respective governments and national military intelligence agencies of the respective countries. And the idea of the strategy of tension was this notion that there would be an effort to basically mobilize right-wing groups that either masquerade as communists or actually fund and create communist groups that would engage in various kinds of provocation and insurgency or various kinds of activities that would ultimately discredit them in the eyes of the general population. So it was very much in the context of the Cold War and of the US kind of geopolitical goal to dominate Western Europe and to exert NATO's hegemony over Western Europe as the kind of principal security architecture, and to basically to push away the kind of the danger that these countries might shift towards socialist kind of values, or of course the danger, it was described as being a communist threat. And this is quite interesting because a lot of the historical data shows that the Soviet Union, there was really very little prospect of the Soviet Union actually invading Western Europe at this time. But there was a need in order for Europe to stay within NATO, and for the US to kind of consolidate this Western European security architecture through NATO, which involved obviously all sorts of things from economic aid to military aid to intelligence cooperation and all the rest of it. There needed to be this idea that the Soviets were ready to invade Western Europe. So really the strategy of tension was actually very much about kind of trying to demonstrate the extent to which the Soviets were involved in subversive and dangerous activity, which could indicate a threat that required the US to kind of and European countries to kind of be ready and to kind of police the domestic communist thought and kind of keep an eye out for radical communist activities and all the rest of it. Essentially justified extensive surveillance of academics, of activists, journalists, all sorts of all sorts of kind of surveillance and kind of monitoring. So that sums up the idea of strategy of tension, and people who are interested to kind of read more about how this policy played out, it should read, I think, the definitive historical work by Daniel Ganser in his book Operation Gladio, about specifically focusing on Operation Gladio in Italy. The book is called NATO's Secret Armies, and it's published by Routledge, which is a very, very reputable academic publisher.
Right. I also recommend there's a documentary from years ago from the BBC that did a series on Operation Gladio, and we'll get into Gladio in a little bit. So essentially, the strategy of tension is using, I guess you could say, terrorism or what people consider false flag attacks in order to influence policy and so forth.
That's it. I'm wary of using the terms like false flag attacks. Just because yeah, it's fine. It's just that I find the term to be used in so many different contexts by people who are reading about these things, but often believe in theories which don't really necessarily have much evidence for them. And so the term false flag has become this kind of catch-all term, to kind of capture anything that happens. So I'm quite wary of using that kind of terminology. I think it's really important that people who are serious about understanding history and understanding what's going on in the world today try to be as precise as possible in the type of language that we're using. I mean, obviously I understand what the term is getting at, and I kind of agree with it to that extent, in the sense that what we're talking about here is deniable operations which are carried out that the CIA can basically wash its hands of and say, well, we didn't do that, we're not involved in that. And obviously that's the whole point of having a secret intelligence agency, to be able to do things which a government will not be able to do publicly, but to do secretly, so that it can deny involvement in that. And that's the kind of essence of the idea of false flag. But I think, in this particular context, we are certainly talking about operations where we have terrorist activity being in some way promoted or facilitated in order to influence the political decisions of local populations. And in that context, where the idea of a false flag does become relevant is in the sense that there is a very deliberate and conscious effort to project an enemy external to whoever is considered to be us. And that enemy is basically where we have then this idea of a false flag. But what's interesting with that is that sometimes it doesn't have to be a false flag. Sometimes it can be a case of actually of having a real group of terrorists do something, but they're provoked into doing it, or that kind of thing. But I mean, people often find this difficult to stomach, but it's worth looking at special forces operations manuals over the last few years. I mean, there was one that was released by WikiLeaks in, I think it was 2008, a special forces manual, which was restricted. But if you have a look at these kinds of documents, you begin to see how actually central that kind of thinking, whether we call it the strategy of tension, or we call it more colloquially false flag terrorism. Actually, this kind of strategy is referred to very, very directly in these documents as the kind of the use and abuse of terrorism in order to basically influence populations.
Right. Well, you were talking about the terminology of false flag attack, and honestly, I got that from Wikipedia. I looked up the definition for strategy of tension, and I got that from Wikipedia. But I hate that phrase, and the reason that I do is that, as you said, it's been so overused, and like within hours of something horrible happening, there are people out there saying, false flag attack, false flag attack. And what's happened...
Absolutely, yeah.
What's happened is it's become a keyword that essentially shuts people down from hearing anything else you have to say after that. Because it's been so overused. It's like the boy who cried wolf. So it's definitely one of those phrases. Now, we were told that any relationship that we had with the Mujahideen ended after the Afghanistan-Russia war. Why is this statement false? And can you name some instances in the 90s where terrorists were used as proxies?
Well, this is obviously something that I've been working on for a long time. But I think the narrative that we kind of separated from bin Laden after the Cold War is still today promulgated very widely as conventional wisdom. The story is essentially, we teamed up with, we used the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union, and after the Soviet Union collapsed, there wasn't any need to kind of maintain connections with these guys, and they turned against us, and ever since then bin Laden's been fighting his war on terror against us. War of terror against us. I mean, that's the kind of the general way it's seen, and there's certainly some truth to that, in the sense that clearly there are these networks. We've seen from information that has come out in the media, and from whistleblowers who've come out on the record and talked about what the things that they've been investigating, it's very clear that there are very real these Islamist networks affiliated to Al-Qaeda that have been planning attacks and killing people and committing atrocities, sometimes against Muslims and sometimes against Western targets. And this is a real phenomenon. But where it gets complicated is in the claim that there was this clean break with these networks, which just is completely and utterly false. It's so false, it's just absurd. On the contrary, actually, after the Cold War, our use and proliferation of these different Mujahideen networks really proliferated across many strategic areas, and I think one of the first operations began in 1991 in Azerbaijan, when we had various groups that were literally flown in to Azerbaijan, and they basically were on behalf of they were done. All this happened under the kind of the rubric of this American company, interestingly called Mega Oil. But we had some of the same guys that were involved in the Iran-Contra Scandal who were actually involved in Mega Oil, and they were funneling these Mujahideen from Afghanistan into Azerbaijan in order to basically destabilize the government and kind of install a government that was more friendly to the United States local interests. And in the end, they did succeed in changing the political configuration there and getting their favored kind of client, dictator. Since then, the Aliyev dynasty, effectively in Azerbaijan, has basically reigned over there, and has been very, very amenable to kind of corporate investment, and British Petroleum and other major Western companies are heavy investors there. So, and that interestingly then paved the way for operations involving the Mujahideen to extend into the Balkans. So from 92 to 95, we had this situation where obviously the Yugoslavia was going through a crisis. IMF and World Bank structural adjustment programs had effectively destroyed the Yugoslav socialist economy. They were increasing ethnic tensions due to the collapse of wages and kind of massive austerity measures and all that kind of stuff. Interestingly, the CIA had actually predicted that the impact of the IMF World Bank structural adjustment programs would basically be the complete dislocation of Yugoslavia. So there were elements of the establishment that kind of knew what was coming. And so we had this situation where, eventually, things really broke down. War began to, broke out in that part of the world. And, our role in that was, people talk about our role in terms of trying to, have humanitarian peacekeeping and get peacekeepers in, and that we failed to kind of protect Srebrenica. And all of that is true. We had a very real genocide of something like 10,000 civilians were killed in Srebrenica by the Serbs, and that is a very valid reality. However, what is not really looked at is the direct role that the Pentagon played in really accelerating the conflict, because what emerged from the Dutch government's investigation into the failure of the Dutch UN peacekeepers to prevent the genocide of Srebrenica, even though they were there on the ground. The appendix to that investigation was written by a Dutch intelligence expert. I think his name is Professor C. Wiebes, who refers to Dutch intelligence files which basically document extensively the role of the Pentagon in literally flying in Mujahideen from Afghanistan, from Azerbaijan, from other areas, into Bosnia, and essentially using them as shock troops. So that element of the conflict is something which isn't well known. Now, these guys obviously were very extreme. They were quite happy to use tremendous violence, and they did play a role in accelerating the conflict. There were cases of these shock troops, these mercenaries that the Pentagon had brought in, effectively killing Serb civilians, massacring whole villages, and committing other kinds of war crimes. And so we played a very interesting role in effectively dividing and ruling this territory and destabilizing the region. We can have a big debate about why this took place and what the objective was, and maybe it was just short-sighted or whatever. But that kind of strategy continued in Kosovo again when we teamed up with the KLA, which is of course much more well known. But what isn't so well known is the extent to which the KLA again was very much affiliated with Al-Qaeda. And there are many press reports which confirmed at the time that senior bin Laden operatives had actually traveled to Kosovo, including Ayman al-Zawahiri's brother. Obviously, Ayman al-Zawahiri is currently considered the emir of Al-Qaeda. His brother went to KLA and was a senior commander there, and he basically actually participated as a leader of a KLA unit and was involved in recruiting and funneling people into various Mujahideen networks into the KLA. These are the same people that we again sponsored in the context of the Kosovo conflict. Now, in the aftermath of all of this, we've now seen a situation where all of this destabilization has played an interesting role, coincidentally, in essentially eroding any kind of drive that may have existed locally for nationalist, socialist type of politics, and instead served to allow the United States, on the one hand, to establish a series of military bases in all of these countries, heading towards Eastern Europe, towards the border of Russia, and at the same time also allowing the United States and Britain to have a much bigger political and diplomatic role in the region, which has allowed them to kind of push forward a very market-oriented set of economic principles that has opened up the region to foreign investors and allowed the US and Britain to kind of go in and, most interestingly, to pursue this Trans-Balkan pipeline, which is operational at the moment, and which plays a major role now in the transport of gas across Europe. So, there's lots of different explanations for whether, for how this has occurred, but at the end of the day, I think it's pretty clear that throughout this period, and I'm only talking about the Balkans here, and there's many other cases happening at around similar times in this context, but where we've seen these Al-Qaeda affiliated groups being used by our intelligence agencies for these geopolitical purposes. And I think that's the kind of the real issue that raises the question as to what extent we really did break away from these groups.
Well, just so everybody knows, there are entries on historycommons.org that goes over some of this, especially the Pentagon, flying in people and so on and so forth. One of the things that you mentioned was people from the Iran-Contra Scandal. And sometime in March 2007, Seymour Hersh of the New Yorker wrote a report that essentially said that the Iran-Contra veterans that were working out of Dick Cheney's office were using stolen funds from Iraq to arm Al-Qaeda-type groups and foment a larger Sunni-Shia war And let's see. It's just interesting, people should know that a lot of people from the Iran-Contra affair are involved in this type of operations, and they were very much involved in the Bush administration. Now, after 9/11, there were other instances of us, again, using terrorists as proxies. And I want people to understand why it's so important to bring attention to this issue. One of the main reasons is that it takes away the legitimacy for the entire quote-unquote war on terror. If you're supporting terrorists, how can you be having a war on terror? And it's just, absolutely ridiculous. And, people need to be held accountable for their actions with regards to this. But after 9/11, we used the CIA, ISI connections to use Jundullah in Iran. During what happened in Libya, we allied ourselves with Al-Qaeda-linked groups, the people John McCain photographed himself with. And in Syria, the Saudi Arabians armed, funded, and sent in rebels along with Qatar and Kuwait. And then we started training rebels in Jordan to send into Syria in an effort to take out Assad. And before we started arming or training rebels in Jordan, we were sending the quote-unquote rebels intelligence and some aid and arms and so forth. So, there's no such thing as a moderate rebel. What do you have to say about moderate rebel?
Well, I think this is a complex issue because the Syrian opposition and the Syrian rebels are made up of a huge number of different factions. By some estimates, there's something like over 1,000 different groups and entities. And the one thing I would emphasize is that, again, when we're kind of looking at these issues, it's important to step back, and especially when we're not specialists in the region, to kind of step back, have a little bit of humility, and kind of try to understand the region, try to understand the complexity, realize that we're probably not going to be able to. And in that context, I think it's important for people to realize that, what happened in Syria, there was a very real uprising. And Assad's regime is an extremely brutal regime. And, for people who are basically now, you get some idiots who are basically think that because, the Americans or the British don't like Assad, therefore, we need to kind of, recognize that Assad is a good guy. He must be a good guy because, they're against him. We have to remember that, before this whole kind of concerted kind of effort against Assad began a couple of years ago, Assad was being used in the context of the war on terror. There was ample cooperation with the CIA and with the rendition programs. He was, facilitating rendition. Correct. He was facilitating torture on behalf of the CIA. So for us to turn around on the one hand and say, Assad's a bad guy, is a bit of a joke because he was a bad guy. We didn't like him, but we used him when we needed to. So to what extent he was a bad guy, is really relative. He was a bad guy, but he kind of was bad enough for us to use him when it came to torturing so-called terror suspects, which we decided that we didn't want to prosecute them in a court of law, so we just tortured them instead. So there's a real question mark over there. But in terms of so that just sets the scene in terms of Assad is a genuinely horrible guy, and he did run a very sectarian regime that generally discriminated against Sunnis. And I think in the context of some of the problems the country was facing, there was a regional drought in the country which led to migrations of farmers into cities because their crops were failing. And most of those guys, therefore, they were Sunnis moving into these kind of slightly wealthier urban areas that were dominated by the Aliyevs, or those were the kind of clans that were dominated by Assad. So what we had then is that kind of created these more sectarian tensions, because obviously, at the end of the day, Assad favoured people of his own clan, people of his own ethnicity. And so really tensions started to build, and people really started to feel the problems. This kind of recession, and the unemployment issues kicked in, and all the rest of it. So when the uprising took place in the context of the wider kind of Arab Spring, which was already kicking off everywhere else, it was a real uprising. There were people who were genuinely on the streets. They were angry. But what we now know...
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. Don't worry, John. What we now know is that there were efforts to co-opt this uprising, to co-opt this rebellion, which actually began even before it kicked off. And in a recent Guardian piece I wrote, I mentioned a WikiLeaks cable that showed that the State Department was actually aware that the drought in Syria was causing problems, and they knew there was going to be unrest, and that was as early as 2008, I believe. Now, in 2009, we know, according to the former French Foreign Minister, Roland Dumas, speaking on French mainstream TV, he said that he was in Britain in 2009, and he was told by Foreign Office officials that they were planning something in Syria, and they were working with people on the ground, opposition groups, rebels, to foster some kind of move against Assad. So what this shows is that as early as 2009, the British and US Special Forces were on the ground doing something, messing around. So when the uprising kicked off, we already had people there. Now, in 2011, we know from the cables that, not the cables, the emails that were obtained by WikiLeaks from Stratfor, the US private intelligence firm, we know that those guys had meetings with Pentagon officials where they were told that in 2011 they were on the ground, working actively with rebel groups, conducting operations, planning operations, providing aid, providing training, and that the whole point of this kind of activity was to destabilize the Assad regime from within. So this process of co-opting these rebel groups was accelerating. We also know from all of the kind of press reports that have come out, whether it's the Washington Post, the New York Times, that the United States began covertly coordinating funding for these rebel groups from some of the most dictatorial regimes in the region, namely Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Kuwait. And we also know that classified assessments of the nature of this funding and who the funding was going to showed that the vast bulk of the money was going to affect, essentially the most virulent Islamist extremist rebels that were affiliated to Al-Qaeda. And that's not a surprise given everything that we've discussed, because that's who these guys have always been funding. Saudi, Qatar, that's who these guys know. They don't know anybody else to fund. They have established networks and links with these guys, so they're going to fund the same guys. So increasingly, the rebel movement began to get hijacked. There were genuinely secular, moderate factions, and they still are moderate factions in the Syrian movement. However, those have increasingly become marginalized as this money has poured in. And it's got to a point where when groups like Al-Qaeda kind of began to increasingly kind of hijack this rebel movement and the rebel operations, and we had the emergence of the Al-Nusra Front and ISIS and all the rest of it, and several other kind of Al-Qaeda linked groups have been active there as well. Well, the moderate rebels, because they were having so many issues and so many challenges, they began to welcome these groups purely because they were military very competent. They had good training. They had a lot of experience, and they often came with heavy weapons as well. And we know, for example, that we have very, very strong circumstantial evidence that what was going on in Benghazi, in the U.S. Embassy in Benghazi, was a covert CIA operation to smuggle heavy weapons across the border to the Syrian rebels. So, and that was actually being done with the support of the local Al-Qaeda groups. So, this whole kind of involvement of Al-Qaeda is something that was directly facilitated by what the U.S. kind of intelligence services were doing on the ground. So the question of, so that brings me to your question, John, of this issue of, are there, there's no such thing as a moderate rebel. I mean, I wouldn't say that there's no such thing as a moderate rebel. I think that does a disservice to the people, the real kind of genuine kind of people who are resisting Assad and having a very genuine resistance movement. But I think at the same time we've reached this situation where to not call out the reality of the extent to which the moderates have been sidelined in terms of their power, would also be a disservice, because they have been sidelined. And now we've got to this point where, before James Foley was killed, his location was passed on to ISIS by certain moderate rebels. So, we've got this situation where, I think the question of, to what extent is there, a real kind of moderate force in Syria, I think it's maybe a little bit too simplistic, but it is a legitimate question in the sense that, okay, fine, we might have some moderate people there, but how the hell do we access these guys? Because we've got to this point where they're working together, and most recently, after the airstrikes, as you probably were maybe going to mention this, after the airstrikes that we've had, the moderates have signed a pact with ISIS saying that, we won't fight with you. Yeah.
But the point of my question with regards to moderate rebels is that nobody has the ability to really differentiate between what would be a good rebel. I mean, yes, you talked about there being legitimate rebels out there, but when the U.S. is arming and funding and training people, I don't honestly think they care. Or I don't think that they have the ability to distinguish, or I don't think they put much thought into it.
Honestly. I think on that issue, there's two things to say, I think. And first of all, there's the somewhat more measured kind of mainstream criticism, which is that, they don't have the ability to really vet the rebels. And I think if we look at the vetting process, there was a Mother Jones investigation into the vetting process, which shows that basically the vetting process is completely pointless, and their arms are being supplied to so-called moderate or secular rebels, and they're still ending up in the hands of the extremists. So there is this thing of, they don't have the competence, they don't have the knowledge, they don't know what the hell they're doing. And I think, that's obviously the case. But the second issue is, like you said, do they care? And what we've seen consistently over the last 3 to 4 years that, we've had this we've been involved in Syria, is not actually so much that it's not even that we don't care. It's actually that, from all the evidence that we can see, the United States and Britain are knowingly coordinating assistance to people that we know will end up either basically being radical or passing the weapons on to people who are radical. By radical, obviously, I don't mean progressively radical in a good way. I mean radical in an extremist way, in a very dangerous and worrying way. And that's something that, we say 2-3 years ago, we've had classified assessments which show that we've got the Saudis going in there, and we've got Qatar going in there, and they're supplying, according to some estimates, something up to $1 billion of aid is actually being supplied in total by these Gulf states. And we now our classified assessments are saying that the majority of that funding has gone to the extremists. Now, for us to then be coordinating with the same people and keeping the same very loose vetting arrangements, there was an investigation by The National, which is the Dubai-based newspaper, which basically showed, again, the same thing, that, there's a command and control center in Jordan. We've got Turkey involved, we've got Saudi, Qatar, and all these other guys involved. We've got Israeli commandos, Jordanian commandos, US and British and French commandos there on the ground training these guys. But what they said is that actually, these guys, they don't care. They've devolved the vetting process to local rebel commanders. There's no centralized vetting process. So they have deliberately devolved that vetting process to local commanders because, and they know that those guys are going to basically, let in who they want and train who they want and allow who they want in. And over the years, we've seen that despite our own kind of oversight processes determining that these are the extremists who are getting funded here, we've just said, hey, let's just carry on. And now we've got the same guys enrolled in this so-called coalition to fight ISIS, who have been doing this, creating this problem, and now we're using them to fight the problem.
Isn't it ridiculous?
Dude, ridiculous doesn't begin to describe. It's literally like we have the same structure in place that has created this problem, and we haven't even changed anything. All we've done is we packaged it and said, "This is our coalition, and we're now fighting a war." Well, and one of the only new thing in this picture is basically we now have airstrikes in Syria and Iraq by the United States.
And also Israel is bombing Syria. They just blew a Syrian jet out of the sky the other day. With regards to Iraq, and I've been saying this for quite a while now, there are people in Iraq who just happen to be angry about a decade's worth of sanctions that killed 1 million people, an occupation that killed upwards of 1.25 million people, the wounding and displacement of millions more, the torture at Abu Ghraib, flushing Qurans down the toilet, Blackwater hunting Iraqis for sport, and all of these things. There's no statute of limitations on the anger that these kinds of things create. And I can imagine that there are a multitude of individuals within Iraq who still oppose, essentially what the empire is trying to do. What do you have to say about that?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, John. I think this really speaks to the kind of the veil that we have on international politics today, where we've launched this self-righteous war in response to this network, that is this terrible network which is rampaging across the region and which has committed these horrifying atrocities of some of our journalists and aid workers, and it's terrible. But what's ironic really here is that we think that it's justified to go and bomb indiscriminately in these countries in response to these atrocities that have been committed by ISIS. And what sparked it off is not the killing of the Yazidis, which we've highlighted in the media, but what sparked it off, what really triggered it was those beheadings and those the televised videos, which really made people angry. Understandably, made people very upset and felt like they need to do something to stop this, to put an end to it. But isn't it interesting?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, if we want to follow this logic through, this particular type of moral logic, what then is the correct response of the Iraqis? So for the Iraqis who have been, as you said, over 1 million people have been killed through sanctions, through war. We've had complete and utter brutalization of Iraqis in these state-sanctioned prisons, which the US has run themselves. Stories of rape, stories of torture, stories of electric shock therapy, these horrific stories extrajudicial executions, the shooting people in the streets. We've had stories not just of Blackwater mercenaries contracted as a Defense Department shooting people in the street. We've also had stories of U.S. Marines shooting people in the street indiscriminately,
right,
given orders by their commanders that anybody with a red scarf in the street should be shot, and then it becomes anybody who is out in the open outside of curfew should be shot. We had the carpet bombing of Fallujah, the complete and utter destruction of the infrastructure.
Using depleted uranium, which has caused, thousands of people, from what I understand, to become sick.
Well, absolutely. Look, we've had the destruction of schools, hospitals, roads, sewage infrastructure. We've had the comprehensive destruction of a society. And
on top of that, we had
the chemical weapons, depleted uranium, as you said. In Fallujah, the rates of deformities, have been flagged up in multiple peer-reviewed studies, and it's appalling. To this day, you have hundreds and hundreds of children coming out with these deformities, horrific deformities, and there's no recourse, there's nothing that they can do. So what is the question really is, what is the response then? Do the Iraqis have the right to now launch airstrikes on the US and Britain? Do they have the right to basically now bomb London or Washington DC or New York? Because that's the logic. The logic is that we have the right, because of these beheadings, because of some of these killings, that ISIS have done, we have the right to basically go there and basically conduct indiscriminate airstrikes and kill, some so-called terrorists, and obviously there are real terrorists who are being killed, but also there are civilians who are being killed.
In Syria, I just saw.
In Syria, yeah. By following this logic, what we see here is that this is the logic of the terrorists. This is the logic of terrorism. Is that you've killed some of ours, so we now have the right to basically kill as many of yours as we want to. And that is exactly what ISIS is doing. ISIS is doing exactly what they've learned from the United States, from Britain.
Right.
That effectively, we have the right to basically bomb the crap out of you. So no wonder they're planning to target us, because that's exactly what we're doing to them.
Exactly. Well, to anyone who would have thought that 13 years of bombing and killing people indiscriminately wouldn't result in a few people getting angry are just not very intelligent.
Our intelligence agencies predicted this. Because, again, another thing which is kind of left in the memory hole is that MI5, MI6, the CIA, all of these agencies predicted that the war in Iraq would be a recruiting sergeant for terrorism, and that Al-Qaeda would become more prominent in Iraq as a direct consequence of the US and British invasion and occupation. And that's what's happened. So
one of the things I want to point out,
exactly what we expected to happen.
One of the things I want to point out, and I mentioned this earlier as far as one of my definitions for Al-Qaeda, Glenn Greenwald wrote a piece years ago, and let me see if I can find the quote. Right. On June 23rd, 2007, Glenn Greenwald wrote about how insurgents in Iraq were being referred to as, quote, Al-Qaeda more frequently. He states, quote, "What makes this practice all the more disturbing is how quickly and obediently the media has adopted the change in terms consciously issued by the Bush administration and their military officials responsible for presenting the Bush view of the war to the press," end quote. And so that's what I mean. The insurgents in Iraq were eventually started to be called Al-Qaeda, and I have no doubt that there are individuals in Iraq who believe they're part of Al-Qaeda and so on and so forth. But, how did it start? Were we just calling them Al-Qaeda?
There's a really valid debate to be had around this, because on the one hand, it's clear that there was a deliberate effort to label any kind of insurgent groups in Iraq any kind of resistance as linked to Al-Qaeda, because this really allowed the US to demonize these groups and to see them as terrorists. And of course there were people conducting very real terrorist activity. But this is where it gets murky, because, Dara Jamal, who is, he was one of the only unembedded reporters in Iraq at the time. And he did an extensive investigation into Zarqawi and the way in which the United States kind of really latched onto the persona of Zarqawi and used the idea of Zarqawi as really a linchpin to kind of promote this specter of there is this centralized Al-Qaeda resistance group that is, has got its tentacles everywhere and is responsible for all of the different attacks and everything else going on. But when he tried to track down, this Zarqawi guy and his personality and who he was and where he came from and the nature of his network, he found increasingly that there was just really nothing there of substance to really back up, who this Zarqawi character was and whether he really existed. And there were real question marks in Iraq as to whether Zarqawi actually existed. And the deeper he dug, the less kind of firm ground he found to really justify this idea. And to kind of back that up, in my recent piece, which was published in a number of places in Truth Out and a couple of other places, how we created the Islamic State, this article I wrote, I looked into some of the kind of the background to what we did in Iraq, and one of the things that was interesting was a U.S. Special Operations University report, which referred to the psychological warfare operations where the United States was covertly promoting Zarqawi's ideology in order to basically discredit him in the wider Iraqi public. And it refers to the U.S. planting press reports and making radio broadcasts to show how horrible and kind of demonic and disgusting Zarqawi and his ideology were. But this is where we start to get this kind of image of really the U.S. was really playing a big role in projecting this kind of idea of this resistance. And what was interesting in this Special Operations University report is it refers to very specifically as the goal of these kinds of psyops, and it refers to psyops quite directly in the text, was to accelerate what it says were red-on-red operations. So in other words, and red refers to enemy, it's color coding for enemy. In other words, to get the enemy fighting the enemy. So in other words, divide and rule. So all of this stuff with kind of promoting Zarqawi and all of that stuff was effectively about trying to get the different groups in Iraq that could be a problem, that were opposed to US occupation, fighting amongst each other. And the report specifically said that they wanted to weaken not just the militants, but also the more peaceful Sufi groups in Iraq who were also opposed to the US occupation, as well as to basically delegitimize the Baathists as well. And so this kind of like feeds into this general idea that yes, there was a deliberate effort by the US to kind of just demonize any kind of resistance in Iraq as part of a terrorist movement. And it was a kind of catch-all term. But to add insult to injury, the United States actually was funneling at one time arms to the Al-Qaeda affiliated factions in Iraq, and this was occurring in around 2005. There was a report in Asia Times by the late Pakistani bureau chief of Asia Times. He was actually murdered by people think by elements of the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence services. But he's a very highly respected journalist, and he reported from Pakistani defense sources that the US was covertly supplying arms through Pakistan to basically getting the Pakistani army to supply weapons to militants linked to Al-Qaeda, linked to the Baathists in Iraq, and the idea, according to these sources, was that they wanted to head off the threat of a Shiite kind of dominated government. So it's interesting because, you know, at the same time, they were actually supporting that government, and they still are. So you can clearly see that this divide and rule strategy entailed playing off a lot of different entities against each other.
Well, now that we've brought up a specific intelligence agency, the Pakistani ISI, who incidentally is notorious for murdering journalists, my next question is, which intelligence, and now we're going to start to talk a little bit about 9/11 specifically, which intelligence agencies are notorious for using terrorists as proxies?
Well, I think it's certainly the intelligence agencies that have been using Al-Qaeda as proxies are the United States intelligence agencies, and specifically I would say the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, indirectly the FBI, in the sense that the FBI have used kind of moles and infiltrators to co-opt extremist groups in order to...
And also to create them. But go ahead.
Yeah, and to create them in order to kind of have these entrapment organizations, entrapment kind of operations. In the UK, definitely, you know, I mean, both MI5 and MI6 have had links to terrorist groups or groups that are involved in recruiting terrorist activity. I mean, MI5 has come up in relation to the group Al-Muhajirun, according to a number of intelligence experts, as well as MI6. And MI6 has also had links to Al-Qaeda. I mean, in fact, I had I did a story on Sybil Edmonds' revelations on Gladio and her efforts to kind of release this information to the Sunday Times. And one of the interesting conversations I had with a Sunday Times journalist who was covering the story is that he said he spoke to a senior official in MI6 who confirmed to him that the essential thrust of what Sybil Edmonds was saying about the financing and covert support to Al-Qaeda-affiliated groups in Central Asia all the way up to 9/11 was true. And this MI6 guy apparently told this guy that, told this journalist for the Sunday Times that this was actually a very real policy that both Britain and the United States were involved in together.
Well, what I'd like to talk about, with regards to that Sunday Times report, the very first one mentioned Lieutenant General Mahmoud Ahmed as being a part of the nuclear black market. For those of you who don't know, there was an allegation that Lieutenant General Mahmoud Ahmed, who was the head of the Pakistani ISI, who was instrumental in getting Musharraf into power, ordered Ahmed Omar Saeed Sheikh to wire transfer $100,000 to Mohammed Atta, the lead 9/11 hijacker. Now, I have never seen anyone in government or in any of the investigations denounce these allegations or explaining why they're incorrect, because they're not reported in the 9/11 report, even though it was one of the questions that the families put forward. So with regards to Lieutenant General Mahmoud Ahmed, he was mentioned in Sibel's story with regards to nuclear black market. He's mentioned with regards to the 9/11 attacks. And yet this is two times the 9/11 Commission, was essentially told about Mahmoud Ahmed, and they really didn't focus on him, to my knowledge, in the 9/11 report. So that was interesting. In other words, it was two times that Mahmoud Ahmed was brought before the 9/11 Commission, and he seemingly wasn't a person of interest. Now, you talked about the reason that the Sunday Times stopped doing their series was because of the fact that it was true. Who told them to stop?
Well, I mean, this is where it's interesting, because when I spoke to the Sunday Times journalist, he described, there was some kind of editorial pressure. Now, Sybil Edmonds had the impression that there was pressure from the State Department, that there was some kind of a meeting between State Department officials, basically people from the U.S. Embassy and the editor of the Sunday Times, and that after that meeting the story was pulled. Now, the journalist that I spoke to wasn't aware of that specific meeting, but what he did say is that there was pressure of some kind. There was a sudden decision that was made to pull the story. And he basically, that's when he actually got, this guy is actually not with the Sunday Times anymore. He left the Sunday Times, to set up like some kind of charity, and he's doing a lot of really exciting, interesting work. But he's not a journalist. He's not even involved in journalism now. So it was weird that he actually was frightened to tell me the mechanism that led to this. And he actually kind of really slammed up. But what he did say is that, he said to me, I really don't want to go into this and I can't tell you this. But there is a mechanism linked to the intelligence services at the Sunday Times which sometimes can come into effect. And I was like, what the hell are you talking about? And he just clammed up and said, I really can't say anything else.
Right.
And obviously he was speaking off the record anyway, but despite being off the record, he just didn't want to say anything. So there's something really murky going on. And all I know is that there was some, from this. This guy's a really good journalist and a credible guy. So we know that there was some kind of insidious pressure that was exerted at the Sunday Times to kill this story, to stop what Sybil Edmonds was revealing, to come out.
Let me explain who Sybil Edmonds is for those who don't know. She was a former FBI translator. She was a 9/11 whistleblower. She was someone who was retaliated against, someone who had 2 gag orders placed on her. And she's actually someone the families snuck into the 9/11 Commission because they weren't responding to her calls to come testify. They snuck her into one of the family 9/11 Commission meetings so they would be forced to hear what she had to say. And she testified in front of the 9/11 Commission inside a skiff, in what's called a skiff, for 3.5 hours. Now, there are things called memorandums for the record that were released by the 9/11 Commission. And essentially what they are is summaries of interviews of different witnesses. And Sybil Edmonds' MFR, or Memorandum for the Record, is completely redacted. Absolutely, from top to bottom, it's completely redacted. Now, just so people know, Sybil has testified under oath with regards to some of these allegations. And early on, there were people like Chuck Grassley, I think, and Senator Leahy who said that there was something, that she was credible. So, this never made it into the 9/11 report. She testified for 3.5 hours before the 9/11 Commission and was given a footnote in the back of the book. Over the years, she broke her gag order and started to tell us the whole story at personal risk. Now, my next question is 9/11 related. In one of your books, you talk about David Shippers. And for those who don't know, he was the chief investigative counsel for the U.S. Judiciary Committee that was investigating the Clinton-Lewinsky affair. Can you please tell us about your interactions with David Shippers?
Well, I spoke to David Shippers for my first book, The War and Truth. He basically was one of the first people that confirmed that there were FBI special agents who had been investigating a plot inside the United States that we now know was the 9/11 operation, that was being pursued by a number of Al-Qaeda-affiliated guys, and that they had names, they had identities, they had been tracking these people, and they, something like 3 months before 9/11, came to David Shippers and said to him that, look, we're investigating these guys. We believe that there's going to be an attack, an imminent attack, on the financial district of Lower Manhattan. Our investigations are being shut down from Washington, D.C. There's a political bureaucracy, there's a political decision here, but these are very real investigations. There's something is going to happen. Can you use your influence to do something about this problem, because something needs to be done. Now, I interviewed Shippers about this, and he spoke to me, and he told me that he had contacted a number of different agencies, that he had spoken to some people in Congress. He had even spoken to the chair of the Intelligence Committee, and I think he said he'd spoken to he spoke to the Speaker of the House as well. But no one did anything. No one basically did very much about this. And so, I mean, now some of these people have, they came and spoke on the record. Colleen Rowley, Robert Wright, a number of other senior FBI guys. We now know their names, and we now can piece together the information that they had. And in all of those cases, now that this stuff has actually come to light, a little bit more available for public scrutiny, we can see how systematically the bureaucracy in Washington inexplicably shut down these completely legitimate investigations, and their heads have not rolled.
Nobody was held accountable. And you mentioned Robert Wright, who is a FBI agent, who is a whistleblower, who David Shippers happened to represent a long time ago. And he was essentially investigating Saudi ties to terrorism. And he did this through a program he called Vulgar Betrayal. And this took place long before 9/11. And it seemed that every time he would get close to something, he would get shut down from above. So the Saudis and their connections to terrorism were essentially protected. And then after 9/11, again, the Saudis and their relationship to terrorism has been protected. The Bush administration made sure that the 28 redacted pages of the Joint Congressional Inquiry were never released. Apparently Obama promised 2 family members that he would release them, and he hasn't. The United States government has gone to great lengths to protect the Saudis against the 9/11 family members with regards to lawsuits and so forth. But now the families finally have a chance to sue, and they're trying to get the 28 redacted pages released so they can use that as evidence. And one of the interesting thoughts I had the other day, Philip Zelikow, who was the executive director of the 9/11 Commission, he was greatly responsible for the 9/11 report not mentioning the information that was in the 28 redacted pages of the Joint Congressional Inquiry. He recently wrote it off in an article that was written by Lawrence Wright. He basically said it wasn't credible. So if the families bring forward this information from the 28 redacted pages as evidence, the Saudis could bring up the 9/11 report, which has nothing, it essentially got them off the hook as a defense. So I wonder if Philip Zelikow would be ever called in to testify, or Dietrich Snell, who also is responsible for none of the allegations regarding the Saudi government going into the 9/11 report. It was very interesting to see, and I hope that made sense to people. Now, there's a question going around right now. By the way, Saudi Arabia, there are allegations that the Saudi government was involved in the 9/11 attacks. The Bandar family, which was friendly with the Bush family, there are allegations that money connected to them made its way to two of the hijackers, and so on and so forth. And all of that has been protected. That information has been protected or concealed from the public over the years. But there's a question going around that I think is interesting, and that question is, why doesn't Al-Qaeda attack Israel?
Well, I mean, that's a kind of I think this is an interesting question, but I think we need to basically think about it a little bit critically. There are some people who think that, Al-Qaeda is not attacking Israel, therefore this proves that Israel is somehow sponsoring Al-Qaeda. I think, on the one hand, I think we need to kind of look at the internal ideology of Al-Qaeda. But before we do that, I think it's important just to break down the logic of this. I mean, just because a group doesn't attack, you can't basically you can't conclude very much by looking at what a group attacks. So, for example, Al-Qaeda has actually attacked Saudi Arabia.
Right.
There have been attacks in Saudi Arabia, but they're funded by Saudi Arabia, and that's something which is very well known. So this kind of simplistic logic of, if a group attacks somebody, then it means that they are not supported by them, and if they don't attack them, then it means that they are supported by them. You can't prove it. There's no kind of real, there's no real basis for that kind of logic. It kind of ignores the fact that, the real world is actually quite complex. It's not as simple as these kind of artificial theoretical constructs that we kind of
first of all,
bandy around. Just to kind of emphasize that point, Greg Palast has documented and investigated this whole issue of the Saudi connection as well, and just points out that, effectively the Saudis are running a giant protection racket, and that one of the reasons that they fund Al-Qaeda is so that they don't carry out their ideological objective, which is, they believe that, the Saudi state is an illegitimate state, and therefore they should be overthrown. So one of the reasons they fund them is basically that, you can do what you like outside, but don't attack us inside Saudi Arabia. And it's something which is not always, there are elements of Al-Qaeda which have operated in Saudi Arabia despite that. So I think just to apply that issue to Israel, well, there's a lot of kind of interesting kind of permutations in relation to how Israel has basically dealt with Islamist groups generally. In relation to Al-Qaeda specifically, I think this really is part of the way we understand Al-Qaeda's internal ideology. For the most part, they have a range of different priorities. And while Israel has certainly played a very important role, when we look at the way in which they have been financed and the way in which they've kind of been geographically active, we begin to see that they don't really have a foothold, only until recently, but they didn't have a foothold in that part of the world. Most of their activities have been centered around, Afghanistan, so this kind of Central Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, but not in the area specifically around Israel were they active until recently. Now, in the context of the Syria conflict, we've actually seen that Al-Qaeda affiliated groups have become much more active in the region and much more active in that region surrounding Israel. And interestingly, that this has coincided with all of this sponsorship that's come in from US allies and so on and so forth, and we've had, this emergence of this new group, ISIS, this breakaway group, which is even more crazy than Al-Qaeda. And now we've had the emergence of these very disturbing reports that Israel has actually, to some extent, allowed some of these groups to actually become active in the context of their support for the rebels in Syria. I mean, one of the sources that has described this process was the Jerusalem-based private intelligence firm, Devka-File, which certainly, is not an anti-Israeli organization. And even though some people have questioned their reporting, and obviously, their reporting isn't always solid, but it's worth remembering that the people who run Devka-File used to work for The Economist for something like nearly 2 decades, reporting on Middle Eastern issues. So it's not that the Devka-File are just a bunch of crazies. They do have their ear to the ground, and they've been consistently reporting in the last year or so that Israel has, and the United States, has actually tacitly and directly been supporting some of these Al-Qaeda-affiliated Islamist groups in the region. It raises a lot of interesting questions about ISIS, the relationship of ISIS to the wider geopolitics of the region, because of course ISIS have now come to dominate. ISIS and the Al-Nusra Front are very active in the Golan Heights, and there has been some evidence that Netanyahu has actually been courting some of these groups, and that there are Israeli military hospitals which have actually been providing support to ISIS and Al-Qaeda groups in the Golan Heights. There's been some other reports of Israeli NGOs which have been supplying so-called humanitarian aid to elements of the rebels, and again, that this has gone to some of the extremist groups. So there are a lot of question marks, I would say, recently over what Israel's relationship is to some of these groups.
Well, Israel was essentially responsible for the creation of Hamas back in 1986, I believe, as a counter to the PLO. And that's something that a lot of people don't know about. But during the recent quote-unquote war between Israel and Gaza, Israel was promoting so much propaganda about who was in the Gaza Strip. It was just so ridiculous that so many children were killed. It was a Hamas-run region, even though they had just recently formed a unity government, which Netanyahu told the world to disregard. Anyway, so Israel helped to create Hamas, so that's an instance of the Mossad or whoever using terrorists or whatever.
I think that's an important point. Just for the listeners, in case they're unaware, this is actually very well documented. One of the guys who reported it was Richard Sale, who I'm not sure what he's doing now, but at the time he was a security correspondent for UPI, the wire service, United Press International, and he basically interviewed a number of U.S. intelligence officials, active and former officials, who basically confirmed that actually it was early as the late 70s that Israel had actually very directly created the Hamas organization, and that they had done so, as you said, to create a counterweight to the PLO, because they felt that the PLO had too much international legitimacy, and so they wanted to really find a way of delegitimizing the Palestinian movement for self-determination. So creating this kind of extremist Islamist network was a way of doing that. And that's a theme which has remained present since then. And it speaks to the same thing that we spoke about earlier, this idea of the strategy of tension, where you have governments covertly empowering or manipulating or facilitating terrorist networks in order to influence populations, whether it's public opinion, whether it's local populations, whether it's even on the international scene, whether it's manipulating the decisions that are made internationally. But either way, it's a way of kind of trying to make civil society move in a certain direction as a reactionary response to deal with terrorists and eventually get them to do what you like. So this is a very, very kind of typical kind of case study of that type of activity.
Well, Nafeez, we've already been talking for well over an hour and a half, so I'm just going to ask you my last question. But before I do, I just want to thank you very much for taking the time today. So many important things have been said during this interview. I hope people soak in all the knowledge that you've provided. You're really just an amazing person. So,
thanks, John. It's really kind of you, and likewise. I mean, I've known you kind of virtually for so many years, and I've seen you grow. I've seen you kind of deal with so many different struggles. So it's really a great thing to be able to kind of speak to you in person and to see you kind of always doing something exciting and new. And one thing I have to say, John, that I totally really respect so much about you is that despite being, people might look at you and be like, who the hell is John Gold, But what I think is inspiring and what I would love people to be able to take from the kind of the stuff that you've done is to say that you don't have to be, there's no such thing as basically, a special kind of academic type of person or an activist type of person. You can be an ordinary guy. But all you have to do is really stand up and take a stand and decide to do something and make a change. And I think the stuff that you've been doing with your book and with your new radio show is really inspiring example of how anybody can really kind of if they're really committed to kind of trying to do something and make a change, all they need to do is do something different. So it's a privilege to be able to speak to you, man.
Well, I thank you very much, Dr. Nafeez Ahmed. My last question is, you recently released a fictional new book entitled 0 Point. Can you tell us the premise of the book, where people can find it, and how much of the book is based on real information?
Well, you could probably have a whole show about some of the stuff that comes up in the book.
We just did
a lot of different things. Yeah, I know. But it goes into a lot of different things. But the general premise of the book, I wrote the book because, I felt that we need to, you can't change things just by doing politics, because there's only a small constituency of people that are really engaged in those kind of debates. And we need to, there's a need to kind of engage in cultural change, cultural transformation. So I wanted to use the medium of storytelling as a way of getting out some of these ideas, kind of looking at some of the interesting things the kind of stuff that we've been talking about, but a lot of other different things. So the story is basically set in a near future world, where we've actually had a fourth Iraq war, and the US and the UK have reinvaded Iraq, they've reoccupied Iraq, and they've been actually in Iraq for many years. And in fact, societies have become quite jaded and quite used to this permanent state of war mobilization in that part of the world. And so obviously the story goes into trying to explore what that kind of means for your society when you're in that kind of state of war. And it tries to look at issues like blowback at home, issues like mass surveillance and civil liberties. But it also explores a lot of other more arcane issues that people probably aren't aware of, such as some of these covert operations that have been going on, some of these kind of these disturbing relationships with terrorist groups, kind of corruption of the political and intelligence system, and also, generally tries to kind of set out a scenario for where we could go, where our societies could go, if these kinds of business as usual policies continue. So it's all kind of very kind of a lot of stuff about espionage and kind of political kind of shenanigans. But ultimately, it's a story. It's when I wrote it, I wrote it to be something that people could engage in, could enjoy. It's supposed to be a fun and entertaining read. But the idea is that you'll read it, you'll enjoy it, but you'll also be empowered with a kind of a new vision and a new kind of sense of where we are and where things could be. In terms of the book is out now. People can get a hold of it from Amazon. Is probably one of the most easiest places to get it, but you can get it in ebook format. You can get it in paperback. You can easily order it from your local bookshops, and I'd encourage people to do that. So yeah, that pretty much sums up what I try to do with 0 Point.
Wonderful. I recommend that everybody pick it up and give it a read. Again, Nafeez, thank you for your time today. I wish you luck in all of your future endeavors. I look forward to reading everything you have to write. Be well.
Thanks a lot, John. Take care.
All right. Have a good day.
You too.
A blood-soaked race against time to stop quantum apocalypse. When the British Prime Minister is assassinated on the streets of a capital city besieged by rioting, recession, and power blackouts, the ex-soldier and whistleblower who failed to save him, cop David Ariel, is first in the frame of a corrupt investigation. Determined to hunt down the PM's killers and clear his name, Ariel uncovers more than he bargained for, an ancient war to control horrifying technologies which could rip apart the fabric of space-time itself. As the world he thought he knew unravels, Ariel faces off against bent coppers, double-crossing agents, psychic killers, and super soldiers to complete a Black Ops mission like no other. Stop Quantum Apocalypse. This new book, 0 Point, from Dr. Nafeez Ahmed, is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other book sites.